The landscape of digital data is changing dramatically. We're seeing huge differences in ways in which people engage with technology and the modes in which they provide their information. We've seen the emergence of FitBit and now the Apple Watch. Patients are already starting to engage with their own information to make key decisions. And healthcare needs to understand these emerging trends to be able to tap into these data sets and use them to the best of our abilities. The collection of all this information is going to completely transform the way that we understand our own health. It's about understanding the risks and being able to mitigate the concerns around privacy, and also that we're educating users about what we're doing with the information, what the purpose is, and building that trust. Once we start to analyze that information down, filter it, organize it, we can come up with new insights that any individual could never have had about that particular patient. People should care about big data because, of course, the more information that we have about an individual, the better that we can represent their health. How do we feed that information together to build better risk assessment is where the future is going.
Hi, you came back. We're going to have a panel. Come on up, panel. And the title of this panel is Patient Engagement in a Big Data World, which I call Big Data, Good or Bad. And our moderator for this panel is Kara Miller. Kara is an innovator in her own right because she had an idea a few years ago that people would be interested in a show on radio about innovation with innovators. And she pitched it and got it accepted and started it. And it's now, she tells me, on 50 stations across the country and is one of the few things I ever listen to or watch because I'm too busy doing other things. I don't know what it is. Kara, take it away.
Great. Well, I think this is going to be a fascinating panel. You know, we've been hearing all day about the power of big data. And I think one of the real questions is, okay, then how do you implement it? And we know now, for example, that most of us, you know, have our physicals at random times that make no sense, although they make sense for our schedule, they make sense for the doctor's schedule. But beyond that, they don't make any medical sense. So the question is, as you wear your Fitbit, as you wear your Nike Fuel Band, as you start to figure out maybe there is a good time for a physical because maybe something's been happening that maybe somebody should check out and you shouldn't wait 3 months to talk to somebody about it, is big data going to have, an implication? And obviously, talked about Watson, this idea of a computer that was so encyclopedic that could beat, Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter on Jeopardy. Now being at Memorial Sloan Kettering, MD Anderson, all sorts of places, and being able to really take that information and hopefully help doctors diagnose is this kind of step into, fine, how do you implement big data in a way that really works? I have an amazing and big panel to talk about this. So let's start with John on the end. They're all going to introduce themselves.
Okay. Hello, my name is John Brownstein. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Boston Children's Hospital, where my role is really to think about ideas that exist within the hospital, where we try to accelerate them within the hospital, but also outside the walls, as well as try to work closely with startups and large corporations that are interested in pediatric medicine and health, and where we can work together to build new technologies and new tools. I also, myself, I'm a researcher, faculty. I run a digital health research group. And really what we think about is data that exists outside of traditional healthcare, so what we call the digital exhaust, our interactions with technologies, social media, mobile phones, and how that kind of data can integrate into healthcare and public health.
So my name is Will Crawford. I'm VP of Engineering and the head of the Boston office at FitBit. So we make Fitbits, and we're just actually down the street at One Marina Park. I am responsible for a whole bunch of different things there, both in terms of engineering and also events like this and our presence in the city. But I'm also a two-time former Children's Hospital person. I actually started my career working with Zach Kohani at CHIP, back in the mid-90s on early web EMRs, and most of my career following on that has had some touch on data, whether in the research context, in the patient-controlled health records context, the acute care record space. I used to be the CEO of a small electronic health records company. And then, so in a way, I'm actually as far from direct care provisioning as I've ever been at Fitbit, but still very much aligned with the last 20 years. So.
Jackson Wilkinson. I'm the founder of a company called Kinsights. We help connect parents of children with rare and complex diseases and try to dramatically improve the signal-to-noise ratio for the advice that they get day in and day out. I'm relatively new to healthcare. I married into it. My wife's here at Boston Children's. My background's consumer web. I was head of design lead at LinkedIn and director of user experience at a company that sold to Twitter later on.
Thanks for having me here. Aman Bhandari. I work at Merck and help run our corporate partnerships in the data and technology space. And one of the things that we try to do is bring a dose of innovation inside the company to make our research better.
Stephen Friend, did some of my early training days at Boston Children's and stayed on in the faculty. Then went on and ran a biotech company named Rosetta, and then spent time at Merck running discovery and development for onc and neuro. But the last 8 years, 7 years, I've been interested as a nonprofit foundation in how data flows, how it's shared, privacy issues, how researchers could work together in different ways. And then in the last 2 years, we've been working on digital data in particular. How can you generate data outside the medical system, and what is the value of that to research?
Good afternoon. My name is Andy Wiesenthal. I'm a PEDS ID doc. I trained a long time ago and was a clinician for more than 30 years. Most of that at Kaiser Permanente, and more recently I'm the children's practice leader at Deloitte Consulting. And I've been living this dream of patient engagement and physician engagement in healthcare with technology for a very long time. I was responsible for Kaiser's electronic health record implementation nationally and for all the tools that patients get to use online. And if you want, I'll give you an example as we get through the course of how it actually affected me as a Kaiser member, but we'll get to that in a minute.
So we're going to talk for a while, and then we want to open it up to you. So be thinking of your questions as we go along. But John, I'm going to start with you. If you actually take yourself out of the role of working at Children's for a minute and just think of yourself as a patient, where are we now? Does big data impact your life as a patient now, or are we just talking about, no, this is the way things are going to be in 5 or 10 years or 15 or whatever?
Right. I mean, I guess it depends in what context, right? So big data is impacting me as a patient in that I am thinking about, the data that comes from the devices that I wear, like my Fitbit or Apple Watch. Those are actually making concrete, life impact decisions. So, I may choose to walk a little further every day, may choose to do different things with my lifestyle habits. But in the context of clinical care, it's very limited. I'm not seeing any of the data that I'm generating in the course of my day-to-day getting into my EMR. I'm not seeing any feedback mechanisms. I'm not seeing information flowing to me other than, my one or twice seeing a clinician every year. And that's really where the promise is it's not about the one-off interactions that you have. It's more the continuous, aspect of data coming into your, day-to-day life. And that's what we're talking about today. This is not, rocket science. This is not something super complicated. It can happen with the right mix of sort of interest on the part of EMRs and other types of entities that are sort of forced to think about this. But yeah, we're talking about 5 to 10 years in the broader landscape, I think.
Will, you're at Fitbit. I mean, you've got, before I came here today, my producer was like wearing a Fitbit as she does every day. How do you aggregate? I mean, what is Fitbit doing to change medicine, if anything?
So what we're very focused, and in fact, it's not really, what you just described isn't really the big data experience at Fitbit. It's the small data experience. It's giving you your data and your insights back in a way that's extremely actionable. So as a company, that's our first focus, and that's where we really spent most of the last 8 years, is figuring out how to do that as well as we possibly can. And then getting to the point where we start to put that into some broader context. So the way that we generally do that is through openness, through APIs. I mean, so we have a full API, which means that people can plug in, just as we were hearing about in the keynote this morning, and they can get their data out, and they can integrate that into whatever applications that they that they choose. From a clinical perspective, one of the really neat opportunities that a couple of electronic health record companies are beginning to work with and haven't gotten too far yet, but that I think is fascinating, is being able to pull that data out, put it into context. Again, that individual data, not the aggregate data, although maybe the aggregate data provides some context for it, into context in the clinician visit. And actually, I had a physician over at MGH suggest to me last week that reviewing that FitBit data could actually count as an organ system and get your E&M coding up a level. So he was very excited. Yeah. All right, I got the first laugh line. But it's actually true. I mean, it does. So coming up with ways to make that data available, whether it's via smart platforms or other kinds of integrations, that's sort of the first thing that we can do as a company is try to make that as easy as possible and to do it in a consent framework that keeps the people who use the products comfortable that their data isn't being sold, it's not flying around.
Andy, you want to talk about your sort of experience
I'll
from
speak
the physician end?
as a patient, okay?
Oh, okay.
Because how many other Medicare beneficiaries are here in the audience today? Not too many. But I'm a Kaiser member because I am. That's a retirement benefit for me, and I treasure that because it's really important. And on November 1st, my world exploded around me because I got a text message, I got an anonymized invitation to come to the mobile portal and a phone call at home saying, "You idiot, you have not had your flu shot yet this year." Okay? That's Kaiser using large data saying, we are investing, we're figuring out, we know who's had their flu shots. You have managed to miss yours. It's the season. Get your ass in here. And I knew what would happen if I didn't go do it. And by the way, they also said, here are the hours, here's where you go, here's how you get it. It doesn't cost anything, so come on in. If I failed to do it, they would be like, dogs holding my pant leg, right? They'd be all over me every single day. That would be what would be happening to me. So that's what you were talking about, Bill. They've taken the big data. They know how many millions of people are Medicare beneficiaries and other people, actually everybody who's eligible for influenza immunization. And they're after me. And they won't let go. Why? Because the data tells them it's actually worth it to do that. That's a worthwhile investment for that accountable care delivery system to make. And all of our clients, so I do this, I'm Johnny Appleseed, doing this all around the country, talking to people who are sort of swimming in this trend of becoming accountable for the care of populations, are trying to figure out how to do this. So I think there are some examples like that that are already out there for how to engage with patients successfully, and that you and others in the world are trying to emulate, and we're trying to give ways and models for doing that. So it's not just about the wearables, but it's about who's using the data for what purpose and how you interact with it to get something done for your health.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think taking off on that, I feel as if to bring some realism to the gap that exists. The phrase patient engagement and experience and what it takes to actually have someone feel as if they are one with their device and that, which is a true art to get to happen, sits in a little island separated very far from some very powerful things that could happen, which is where that patient engagement also is an ability to gain an insight into diseases and into modulators. And I think one of the real hard balancing acts is most clinical trials think of participants as subjects in the medieval sense. And you are in my study, and I'm going to do that. And so there's this world of scientists who sort of know how to navigate in that world. And then there's this element of patient engagement and how to have people feel as if they're one. And I think when we put patient engagement together, I think one of the taboo subjects is this dichotomy that exists between what it would be to have participant-centered or even participant-driven research. And what does that look like? And I'm not talking about citizen science, but I am talking about a sense that I'm very frustrated that most data that people have in their self-gratifying apps is going down the drain all the time. all that data may come back to them. But if I'm a researcher, if I'm at Boston Children, and I'm trying to do a study, the ability to actually connect with that and to have a different way of tracking a disease is out there here. And so there's this sort of entertainment, patient engagement zone where things are going on. And then there's, I want to do research, and being realistic about that art of connecting those two, I think is something that we're still trying to figure out.
Aman, let me ask you a question. You can comment on anything you've heard here. This is the voice of the skeptic here, but I have a friend who is a primary care physician in Boston, and she said to me, maybe just a couple months ago, occasionally people will get an email, like here's what happened with your Fitbit, like here's the summary for the last week, or your Nike Fuel Band or whatever, and they'll forward it to me. And she's like, and I already have like 800 emails. I see patients from like 9 a.m. to 6, like I'm supposed to be combing through their Fitbit data. So it seems like there's a gap between people knowing things and making it useful in some sense.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of what I say kind of data chaos in the system. And we still have to bring order to that chaos, and I think it's going to take quite some time. So on the one hand, we have examples where innovation is starting to become democratized, where others are getting involved in healthcare. You can have Fitbit or Apple Watch or other technology companies get involved and have a pretty tremendous impact on a individual by individual basis. On the other hand, the cultural default setting for people in healthcare, to the different stakeholders, is not one in which accepts that more open, connected environment. And so, I think of, Tim O'Reilly coined the term Web 2.0, kind of godfather of a lot of things internet related. He said something 5 years ago at a government meeting where he said, you've got to think about how do you take information and data to the fingertips of consumers and to the customer. And he said that half a decade ago, and we're still struggling with the same thing now. And so we've got tremendous technology advancement, and because of that, innovation is becoming democratized, which is a great thing. On the other hand, the cultural gap that exists internal to the healthcare community is still far and apart from where we need to go. So I think we're still in the early stages of what's going to happen with this chaotic world, and we're starting to build the bridge and the railroad tracks towards getting to a better place, but we're just not there yet.
I'll get to you in a second. Jackson, I wonder if you see that gap, since you work so much with consumers, patients, whatever we want to call them.
Sure, yeah. And the interesting thing about working with parents and working in pediatrics is, that the medical decisions are being made by somebody who is not necessarily the patient, right? And so our goal is to help them make decisions in a more confident and robust way, and sort of in the best interests of the end patient. And so when we're thinking about big data and whatever that happens to mean in whatever context we're talking about, in reality, it has relatively little to do from the consumer perspective with the data itself, right? To go back to the example from Kaiser, it's small data, as Bill termed it, to send an email saying, hey, you should get a flu shot. It's big data to say, it's really worth it to get these emails out to folks because it really makes a huge substantive difference in the overall cost and health of our clinical base. And so in pediatrics, there are so many people who are involved in the care and upbringing and medical care of a child. It's not just the parents, it's not just the physicians, it's also the teachers who need to understand the therapy that the child's on. It's other caretakers who are involved, it's siblings, and everybody really needs to be on board. So insofar as we're able to identify pain points in that care process and bring the right people into the fold so that they can understand the issues that the family is going through in the best interests of the patient, of the child, that's really where the data comes in handy.
Well, I was just listening to Aman and speak, that I was harking back to the conversation around Medtronic and Watson a little earlier. People with serious medical problems and chronic illnesses aren't taken care of by us. They take care of themselves. And so really it's a question of flipping the argument and the concern that your friend had. she needs her patients to have interpretable data about their clinical status so that they know what actions to take for themselves. It's not that I ever wanted for the 150 diabetics in my, and asthmatics and so on in my practice to see 5 or 6 finger stick results every day on all of them, or 3, 4, 5 peak flows on the asthmatics. I'd like, as a clinician, to be alerted to something that's really out of line to make sure that the parent, who is, I hope, already equipped with a good plan for what to do for that, has taken that action. That's the way the system ought to work. So that the data flow and the interpretation should be in parent, in the case of those of us who are pediatricians, in parent interpretable terms. What do I do for my child now that I have this ream of stuff today? More importantly, for the kinds of patients that you have been dealing with, is what's the aggregate experience of all the other parents of kids with unusual problems? What did they do when this came up, and what worked? Because I'd like to know, and the doctor doesn't know, because I'm the once-in-a-lifetime patient for that doctor and for every doctor at that institution, right?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so much of the care in this context has relatively little to do with the medicine or the therapy itself.
Right.
It's, dealing with the second-order effects that are happening at school. Does the teacher understand the issues that the child's going through, and is that sort of accepted in the classroom? How do they get along? Do they have a social community around them and friends? And all of those things are things that you learn from other parents who have gone through those situations, and not necessarily the clinician or the fellow who's been working with you on figuring out exactly what that medical therapy might be. So the context of data in a lot of these questions around caring for deeply sick patients really comes down to things that are really aspects of everyday life and aren't necessarily the things that only get tracked in those primary care or specialist visits at all.
This is a question for Stephen, but then other people may want to get in on it. The companies, in some sense, that have done big, major things with our data so far, I'm not talking about healthcare, I'm just talking about other kinds of data, are companies like Apple and Google. And we certainly have heard that they want a bigger and bigger piece of healthcare. Are they going to be the companies that eventually are the intermediaries that do that thing where they figure out, okay, here's a whole bunch of raw stuff that's been tracked on your body or whatever. Now here's how to make sense of it, and either to the doctor or to the patient themselves?
I don't know. That's the short answer. And I'll answer it, but no, I don't know. And I think very hard to guess what Apple or Google are doing, and they can speak for themselves. But I think a more important issue that you may have been going on to is that many caregivers and many systems that are intending to sort out guidance assume diseases to be much more monolithic than they currently are. And so if you're going to say this kid has autism or this kid has asthma, and your guidance is coming off of that angle of absurd collation, the chance of that decision making is going to be correct is very low. So I think one of the questions, and it could be, is an Google or an Apple, or who is interested in actually taking the effort to actually look at the diversity of disease at a phenotypic level. I think as someone, and I imagine there are people in the audience who is enamored with precision medicine as a genotypic exercise, I now laugh, okay? I think it could be important at a genotypic level, but actually I'm more interested in it at a phenotypic level. And until there is granularity at a phenotypic level, the ability to get the right drug to the right person, assuming that somehow actionable mutations are going to be where the ability to do that is, I think are naive. And I think that task of having the taxonomy, of parsing the diseases that individuals have into their true complexity is something that will be sensor driven. So I don't know what sensor companies will figure it out, but I think it takes a level of sophistication in sensors, in deep learning. Could it be IBM? Could it be that? But I don't think it's going to be a VC-driven startup.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. And the ability to understand phenotypes, not just from sensors, but also from free text information. So you were talking a bit about some of the more consumer-friendly tools. We've worked with companies like Twitter and Google where we need a whole new taxonomy for understanding what the patient voice is saying online, whether it's via tweet or online in a patient forum. There's huge amounts of information that can be gleaned from these types of tools, where that you could create a phenotype that's very different from a clinical data record. And being able to process that information is so key. So from our perspective, the patients are there, so go to those places and amplify their voices, get important signals about their health, get emerging public health signals around infectious disease or drug safety
Outside
signals.
the medical complex,
Absolutely.
is what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly. And so whether it's sensor or free text, there's so much opportunity to paint a picture of an individual.
Well, it's interesting that there's sort of a bit of a, for lack of a better term, Moore's law of big data, right? That over time, what used to be big data ends up being relatively small data. And I'm going to half make this up. You can correct me because it sort of relates to Fitbit. But there's a lot more data that's involved in a Fitbit than a step, right? There's a lot of data that goes into the step. Every little sort of turn of those gyroscopes needs to be then synthesized into the notion of here is a step. And then at that point, so that's like big data a few years ago. There's a lot of stuff that you need to synthesize there. Now you've sort of aggregated that up, it's bubbled up to the next level, and if you're plugged into an Apple device, then you can just sort of track the step. It's sort of this elemental fundamental measurement on which millions of those becomes the big data. And so as we go on over time, these things that we think of as huge amounts of data today will ultimately just be aggregated into each of these indicators that we're thinking about at a more phenotypic level there.
I think a really important part of your question, at least as I interpret it, is I think the technology companies have the ability to be the pipes of the system. And that is of huge importance because in healthcare, if we think about historically, how have we used data in the past and what methods have we applied to that data? In a lot of subdisciplines of healthcare, it's been fundamentally the same over the last 3 or 4 decades. And what that means is the way in which, if I trained as an epidemiologist or as a health services researcher, how I look at my data and analyze that data is no different than it was 2 decades ago. And that's a really scary thought when you think about it, because that means there hasn't been a lot of innovation in the core disciplines of public health in how we take and handle and analyze this data. However, that could fundamentally change with all of these tech companies putting in huge investments. And I think the skill set hasn't quite been there at a critical mass in the way in which it will be now. And the competition for getting that talent in healthcare is coming, because if we take Jackson's example, working at LinkedIn, you wouldn't have heard of that 10 years ago, or even, it's just a more in vogue thing now. And we need that kind of skill set to come into healthcare in a dramatic fashion, or we're not going to achieve what we want to achieve. So I think there's a big skill set gap that's been there for quite a period of time.
Yes, but is there something scary about private companies crunching all that data? I mean, I know you've worked a little bit with Todd Park, who was the CTO of the US, of course, Anish was too. We're talking about patient engagement. Should it only be accessible to private companies or to doctors even? Large data sets, should you be able to find out, what other people who have this kind of cancer and are also from Eastern Europe, you know what I mean? Like, should you be able to find things out that right now you just can't find out on a large scale?
Let me give an example of how I think it can go, because I think your question is a really important one. I wish I could, but here's a piece of it. So you may know that on the first set of research kit apps that came out, one of the features that was made beyond having the code open source, so people could go on to GitHub and pull down the modules, was the fact that actually the data did not go to Apple. That in fact the data was to be controlled by the individual, and we gave individuals, at least the 2 apps that we built out, of do you want the data only for the project with the PI that was doing it, or would you like to share your data broadly? And what we heard, which I think is not a surprise to you who've been working in the areas, 80% of the people said, I want my data out there for anyone to use. So I think that there are not yet rules or principles or guidelines that I think is what you're getting at, that have something to do with what participants want done with their data, but I think it is very different than the way data is currently being generated by most hospital complexes.
Well, and I think that's where Google and others, and Fitbit can play an interesting role, is by making it easier to ask. I mean, going back even before I was at Fitbit, when we were looking at personal health records, and one of the things that we saw was sort of the sicker somebody is, the more likely they are to say, absolutely put my data up on the internet. I think Zach Kohani from Children's coined this term, information altruist. And it's not a difficult question for most people to answer. There are some very specific, usually mental illness-related scenarios where people don't want to share as much. But by and large, there's this openness to do that. Logistically, it's almost impossible to actually do it. So if you can take advantage of infrastructure that people are already using, to just ask that one question.
Let me just put one little blip in there. So that data for many of the apps actually goes through the Sage Bionetworks as a neutral Switzerland for that data, so people can get to. So I don't think it's the only way to do it, but I think the concept of neutral platforms that aren't necessarily the government, that allow people to do that are going to be important, because you have to have some sense of who's going to use it how, not just who you want to contribute. So I think the world should be begging for more Switzerlands where data could be pulled from.
There are three.
Switzerland of data, okay.
There are three harms that could be done if the data, quote, falls into the wrong hands. One is that somebody who can be malicious toward you learns of your diagnosis and just is really nasty. That's largely the mental health stigma in our culture is among the worst. The other, I think, when people can argue this point, I'd love to hear what the audience has to say, has been solved by Obamacare, and that is you can't lose your health insurance anymore because of what you have. You can be more expensive, but you can't lose your health insurance. However, the third, which is a big deal for most sources of commercial health insurance, is you could still probably lose your job, because your utilization will be higher. If they know what you've got, your company could decide to figure out a way to exclude you from employment so that you aren't in their pool and they're not paying for you. If we solve those three problems, my experience of most people is they are highly altruistic about their healthcare data. They want others to learn from their experience, particularly, as you say, if they're very ill and their experience is awful. They want something good to come out of the bad. And I see most people not worrying and putting restrictions if those three guarantees can be made to them. No one's going to embarrass me, no one's going to punish me in terms of employment, and I'll still be able to be cared for in terms of healthcare insurance.
And we saw that come to fruition on Kinsights. Certainly after Obamacare went through, we do a lot of work to obfuscate from the public eye, identifying information in the questions and answers that are on the platform. And we periodically ask folks how we're doing and how much they care about it. And certainly once they weren't at risk of losing their insurance because they've posted on a public forum about it, many, many more folks were comfortable with information being shared with the kinds of folks who actually can take advantage of it.
So I want to go to the audience and take your questions. I mean, there's so much that you can build on here. I'm also interested, if you're a doctor, does it feel like you're living in the era of big data, or do you feel like that kind of hasn't arrived yet? So if there are questions, I think there are, raise your hand if you've got a question, and I think there are mics floating around. If there are none yet, I can fill in, but okay, questions right here. So right here, and then lady on the end. Yes. So here's the mic coming to you.
So we have a relationship in Brooklyn, New York, with a group of very underprivileged children who have asthma, and they hook up through a system, through a smartphone, and that we're able to tell when they take their dose of the inhaler, how many times a day they take it. But in order to convince them to take it, we had to go to the church, the African American church, and get the clergy to really get the families to utilize it. And then the other question, the other issue was, how do you give these patients smartphones so that this data can get to the right sources, particularly in the underprivileged population? And so pharmaceutical companies and companies like FitBit need to work with pharma to get to people who can't afford to buy Fitbit when they're taking medications for uses that would be very advantageous. Another use would be, I know Apple is developing with the blood alcohol levels that can be determined by a smartphone, and decide whether you can drive a car or not drive a car, or whether your blood alcohol level is high. So these are uses that I think could be made, but we're not hearing much about, how do you get these things into the community, and how do you provide people with what they need if they can't afford it to really get the help they need.
I'll take a little quick stab at a piece of that at least. I think that when I've talked to physicians and we talk about underserved communities, there is this sort of general assumption that they are sort of incredibly technologically disadvantaged, which I think is decreasingly the case. There's really no longer any meaningful differentiation in the word smartphone. It's basically just a phone now. Almost any phone that you can get, even the free ones, has a arguably modern version of Android on it or something like that. Not everybody has an iPhone 6S, of course, but you don't need to just be beholden to text messages necessarily anymore, and many of these capabilities are built into the phones. If you're worrying about step tracking, most modern Apple or Android phones will allow you to track stuff with the Fitbit app, even if they don't have a physical, Fitbit device, which of course you want them all to get anyway. But there's a lot more access to modern technology than I think a lot of us in healthcare give those communities credit for.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've focused on is getting products useful products in the market at a bunch of different price points. So I'm of course wearing the big gaudy fancy one that's still cheaper than an Apple Watch. And this this has the 24/7 real-time heart rate monitoring and all the fancy features there. We also have a under $60 pedometer that uses a coin cell battery so that it lasts for several months rather than having to be recharged every week. And that's something that we've been able to get at. We just did a program with Target where we worked with their human resources department to make that level of pedometer available for free and the higher end ones available at a subsidy for every single employee of Target and their distribution center. So it was over 300,000 people who were eligible for that program. And that was something where Target was able to go do their big data analysis on the value that they get from encouraging wellness and weight loss and activity, get behind that program. They're very happy with it so far, and they had tremendous uptake on it. So that's what we could do.
Let me build on that a little bit. Do we talk about really cool technology at a certain level and not pay enough attention to how it filters down, how maybe doctors and people at technology companies think about the world around them, but there's so many different communities and so many different, maybe rural America doesn't get thought about enough. I don't know. I'm not sure. Are we considering every kind of community well enough?
There's a concept in web development called progressive enhancement, which for almost all of you who aren't familiar with it, the notion is that you can take the barest, simplest device that you have access to, and you can still achieve the goals in some way. It might not be the prettiest way, it might not be the slickest way, it might not be the fastest way, but it can still work. And then every capability that your device has on top of it just adds to usually the experience, but that sort of base interaction, that base functionality can exist at an incredibly low level. And I think that that's something that that in healthcare we still need to pay attention to. So I think while we can get away from the notion that folks in disadvantaged communities don't have, never have smartphones and those types of things, we still need to say, well, they might have one, but it might be a relatively crappy one. It might be slow. It might not have, every sensor, possible in it. And what can we still do to try best to achieve those gains so that as the sort of standard technological cycle of expensive devices, coming out first and then kind of those technologies trickling down into less expensive devices takes place, we're kind of always prepared to take advantage of those capabilities.
We actually have our engineers using older Android devices and iPhones, along with whatever the latest and greatest personal thing that they have, so that they do have the experience of using it on those lower spec pieces of hardware. So it's not just.
So I think we've got a microphone going right down there to the end.
There was a lady in the white jacket.
I'm very interested in the amount of data that you have. We've been talking about diseases where we actually know quite a lot about them, but I feel like we're swimming in data that we don't know how to use. We don't know how to interpret. We haven't made the connections. I'm thinking, for example, of genetic information. Everyone's heard of 23andMe, get your DNA sequenced. It doesn't actually help me. It tells me about my risk factors, which actually, if I think about my family history, I already know much of it. But how do we go about integrating a lot more of this data that gives you risk information and these very complex diseases that we are facing?
Stephen, you want to take this?
I can begin. I think others here can. So let me go in on one disease. So we put a fair amount of time into Parkinson's disease. Sitting around Parkinson's disease, as many of the pediatric individuals in the audience know, are a whole over 100 movement disorders. So I'm going to go in on Parkinson's disease here. And what ends up happening is the way that someone is being assessed on a every 6-month basis, as if their disease is a constant degenerative one, has missed, and we have some data coming out, and we're going to put all our data out on the web in the end of November, that day-to-day fluctuations in any chronic disease are going all over the place. And so part of the big data is being able to have what your disease is looking at before and after your medication. And you can look at it, what it looks like before, what it looks like afterwards every day. So that's one of the uses of big data. The next is that for any one person, if you have them take the 1,000 dimensions of data that are in phonation, or the hundreds that are in tapping, or the hundreds that are in gait, you can end up building a personalized classifier that's allowing you to track that individual, more importantly, that person to track themselves. And what you find is 3 drugs that you'd think, oh, they're just going to work in this one dimension, work in different dimensions. So without that big data, you might be going in and going, why is this drug not working for this person? If you're only seeing them infrequently, if you're looking at them in 1 or 2 dimensions, fatigue or just being off gait, you're missing the ability to have windows of intervention that you can't possibly pick up unless you've got something that is granular enough to pick up, sensitive enough to pick up those variations. So there may be those thousands of dimensions, but this comes back to something that was brought up by you earlier. The real power and the short supply is not in coders, it's in analysts. Yeah. The ability to have someone who has enough sense of the biology, enough sense of the engineering to be able to go in and go, here, not just some unsupervised or supervised principal component analysis, you're not going to get to it. So I actually think if you're in the audience and you have some element of clinical knowledge and some sensibility in terms of how to do the data analysis, that's the thing that I think is going to limit this coming in, and that's how you get to 3 features from 1,000. Right.
That's why I mean,
what to give to the person.
Research needs to catch up. I mean, the companies are racing way faster than I think the research community is. I mean, whether it's funding or just people trained in the use of machine learning tools and big data. So this is part of the challenge. We have so much data, but we don't have a research community that has the understanding of the biology plus the computer science. And in fact, many of the people that are skilled in those spaces, unfortunately, are probably not in academia either because they have great offers.
We hire a lot of PhDs.
You're taking them all.
Even great offers, there aren't enough of them.
Right, there are just not enough of them.
But there's a different, I think there's a difference, which is, because as I like what you're saying, there's a myriad of data that can be contributed in non-traditional ways from people who have problems. And the key is to somehow use the techniques that Google in particular, but other large companies in this sphere outside of healthcare have used to change the signal-to-noise ratio so that it extracts meaning. And what you might want, is a more particular profile of people who look a lot like me. They have these 5 or 7 features in common. What's the natural history of their problem? What do they do to intervene, and how does that make them feel, so that you can start to be part of a shared decision-making matrix with your clinician. I think I ought to be doing this based on what we've both learned from the thousands of people who have this. This is a particularly acute problem in pediatric chronic illness, because at any one institution, even your own, which is a magnet institution and attracts people certainly from all over the country, if not the world, the numbers of children with any one special problem are small. It's impossible for you to learn very much except over very long periods of time, and then too many other things are changing before you can sort of get that research question answered. But if you aggregate across the universe of those patients, even just in the United States, but certainly even larger than the United States, now you're onto something. But that means that all kinds of things about the culture of research and the culture of clinical collaboration have to change. And the thing that Dr. Mukherjee pointed out this morning was, at the end of his talk, I thought was the most important innovation of all, and that in the care of children with cancer. And that is, we are all responsible as a collective. We pool our data. We don't guard our data and protect our research careers by having our particular data and our particular research questions and our particular grants. We do it all together because that's the only way we can learn. So if that happens, I think we're really onto something to help patients.
And you asked if folks thought that they were living in a big data world as clinicians and as physicians. And I think that a big data world, the early part of it is kind of a slog, right? Like it's about gathering all of this and making sure that we're breaking down some of the barriers so that we can not have, N of 16 anymore, and we can have the largest possible sample so that we can learn as much as we possibly can. But to your point right there, momentum is incredibly important when you're working in any of this kind of research or in technology development. And there's nothing that kills momentum more than academic medicine, right? It's incredibly challenging when you're in an industry that is accustomed to moving quickly, making decisions, some right, some wrong, and trying to come to conclusions that can be fruitful toward those ends, to come into a system where you might not see it on a day-to-day basis, but it's there. It's challenging to make real progress in academia and academic medicine.
Okay, real quick comment here, and then we're going to go to
The comment I want to make is that the incentive and reward structure, as it's built up in academic research towards papers, towards going towards tenure, someone is going to finally say, this is not productive to society. No, I'm very serious about it.
Do you think that's like YC research?
Well, no, but seriously, there are beginning to be places, I know one at Oxford, where you are promoted to the extent that there was an ability to see how others were able to take things on, not yourself. So I'm not saying that it has to be directly to impact, but fundamentally, if you have systems where the person who has the most resources in academic institutions is the one that has the most high-profile papers that are usually when no one else had access to that data, and you ask people to live in a way that the patients want them to live in it, you have a problem.
Yeah, I was going to say very quickly, the other problem we have is I don't think we even know what to do with the data we have now, let alone the influx of genomic data that's going to come. And so I think we've got a real problem in some sense as a collective, where I think people need to be held more accountable for what's going to happen in a big data world as a community. We just haven't gotten there. And the training's not there. It was just news when it was a couple of weeks ago when major medical schools said, we're going to offer a course in big data, and we're going to offer a specific specialty in that. That shouldn't be news anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
And there's,
let me go to a question.
I got it, please. There's a big opportunity for researchers also to advance the approach for using data that isn't clinically sourced to begin with.
Yep.
So I've had pharma companies come to me and say, we want to use FitBit in a study, and by the way, can you absolutely freeze everything for the next year so that everything stays consistent? So don't change your sleep algorithms, don't change all the microcode that actually converts those accelerometers to steps. Keep everything totally static, and then we'll buy 500 of them.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
No way.
As an employee of Children's Hospital in Boston, we see more and more of patients from overseas, right? and the number is increasing dramatically. So my question is, how do you deal with those patients regarding this big data world? How do you follow up with them once they are discharged? How you reach out to the teachers? What we have here, how it works overseas, for those patients.
Super tricky.
Yeah. So how do you, I don't know if you could all hear that, but how do you take sort of all these big data things that we've been talking about and deal with it if your patient is from overseas, as many people are at Children's, but you see it at UCLA, you see it all over the place, MD Anderson, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, generally super tricky thing, and of course, we being Americans just assume that we're the only ones dealing with these issues, and we're only thinking about ourselves the vast majority of the time, which I think is generally unfortunate. But a lot of the work, hopefully a lot of the work that and I mean you guys inclusive community is doing around interoperability protocols like FHIR and things like that can be somewhat extended beyond the oceans that divide us between other countries. And I think that there's some promise in that, but of course then there are legal quagmires involving transfer of data. We generally had assumed that transferring information between Europe and the US was safe, but then a judge overturned the safe harbor assumption just a couple weeks ago, in fact, and everybody's kind of scrambling to say, all right, do we have to shut down our operations in Europe because we don't have a data center in Europe at this point. So even in that kind of friendly confine, it's really, really tricky, and ultimately, we're not going to get all those things right and perfect the first time around, but it has to happen eventually.
But I mean, honestly, as part of what we're doing even at Children's Hospital, of course, we're thinking about sort of the scaling of our hospital, nationally, but also globally, thinking about tools like remote monitoring, virtual visits. Even we just launched here an opportunity with Grand Rounds to think about second opinions. So of course, we're thinking about how we scale, and I'm sure many other hospitals are thinking the same thing. How do you begin to scale nationally, internationally with digital? And it's either scaling, physicians at the hospital, but it's also taking knowledge and know-how and embedding it into software, into tools, into devices. Anish spoke today about apps on the EMR. That's exactly how we're going to be able to scale sort of our infrastructure, globally.
So part of what I do today means that I interact with the leadership of a great many children's hospitals around the United States. All of them are thinking like that. And they can either solve it one by one and create proprietary platforms with solutions that are sort of micro solutions that kind of work in a little way. Or we can figure out how to do this so that we leverage whatever infrastructure is available around the world. And if there isn't as much of a problem, there is a problem, but there's not as much of a one as we think of in our egocentric ways in the United States. And I'm with you, Jackson. I've seen semi-literate women in India managing microloans for their businesses on their phones. So there is an infrastructure in a great many places around the world that we can take advantage of if we only try. And again, if each children's hospital does it as a one-off, it's not going to work as well as if they can behave as a collective, knowing that they're all interested in extending the mission to countries outside the United States.
We have a chance for one more question. I haven't gotten any from this area. If you have a burning question, I will give priority.
Just burning.
To the people, yeah. Well, to the people I've had my back to this whole time. There's one right here in row 3.
Hi, my name is Al Kwan. I'm a resident at Boston Children's Hospital. My question is, we have a young group of residents who are very receptive to this emerging field and have great interests, but it's still very foreign to us because, like you said, medical school never taught us any of this. What are ways in which we can get more involved? Who should we talk to? Who should we go meet? How do we, what are some of the initial roles as residents that we can take on to get our feet wet in this field?
Just one thing that may be obvious, I'm sorry, others may bring this up, is we were talking about the... We were talking about the lack of resources. And by that I mean to make sense of the data. And one of the things that as a pediatrician / someone who then works on the other side, I think has
That's
seen...
the official term, someone who works on, / someone who works on the other side.
Depending upon where.
Hash.
The other side, the other way. But where I was going to go is investing, those who are early in their careers, who have a deep understanding of the clinical components of a disease, are in a very important position to cross-train into enough of an understanding of how to analyze that data that is not necessarily part of their clinical program, but is essential to sort of growing. So when I was going at Boston Children, David Nathan sent some of us over to MIT. And that was helpful for me. It was helpful for Al and DeAndrea. There are a number of us who benefited as in our fellowship years of doing that. And I highly recommend going to the most technically savvy, deep sort of place to couple all that you've put all that time into understanding on the clinical side, because I don't think it's as hard to bridge that gap. And so I think that people who are in their residency programs looking at where they're going to do fellowship should be looking at places where they can actually engage in that, not just the clinical understanding, but some element of data analysis, whether it's biostatistics, whether it's looking at the math side of things. And it's not hard. I've watched people migrate to that other side.
I think you're in a, I was going to say, you're in a special, if you're in Longwood, you're in a special place on the planet. You're a world-class institution that if you walk 2 blocks in any direction, you're going to have incredible people at your fingertips to be able to get the skill set that you need. If I were, I would go hang out in John's lab or Zach's lab or any informatics group that's local to the area. These are things that were not available to the previous generation. And so, we're counting on people like you to get yourself up to speed in this big data world, because we didn't have that available to us. But you have it available to you within 2 blocks of wherever you are in Longwood.
And there was a huge thing that you said, get yourself up to speed on it. Most folks who work in technology are mostly self-taught. Computer science doesn't teach you anything about building technology products for real, right? So
we can have a conversation.
And the stats just came out, I think, from the Department of Education that the computer science degree enrollment has actually dropped. The reason it's dropped is because more people are self-educating in the coding boot camps that are all over the world now. And so, when a country like Estonia is mandatorily teaching their, first graders how to code, we should be able to do that in Longwood. So I think you can achieve that.
One of the rubs, I think, and we've worked with a few residents and fellows on those types of projects. But I think big rub, and you can probably offer some insight into this, is what's the IP policy around this type of thing? Are folks allowed and encouraged and embraced by Boston Children's to actually engage with outside companies on research projects of their own volition?
Yeah, absolutely. We're absolutely working on that. That's definitely something that all academic medical centers are struggling with. How do you sort of engage with a startup? How do you think about where there's shared IP and commercial interests and research interests and deal with conflicts of interest? But absolutely, that's part of the innovation group, and Tito at Children's Hospital, that's exactly what we're striving for, is to create an environment that brings these people together.
Final question.
So my answer in part to you is, what do you want to do? If pediatricians are natural epidemiologists, if you're going to be a generalist and have a general practice in pediatrics, then you're going to be the master of a team of people that is helping to care for a large population with diverse clinical issues, mostly growing healthy kids. What kinds of data will you need to manage them, and what kinds of skills will you require to manage them? On the other hand, if you're one of the 50% or so of your group that's going to go on and become a subspecialist, then you need to understand how to do what I was talking about before. Aggregate registry information about the illnesses that are particular relevance to your subspecialty and further the cause. Just like the Jimmy Fund clinics started to do 60 years ago in oncology, we need to do that in every pediatric subspecialty. How do you collaborate, share data, analyze together, and those will get you taking in a direction of acquiring different skill sets in order to do that.
And I don't know if you've read his books, or maybe he was here at some panel already, But Alex Sandy Pentland at MIT is a really interesting person to read on big data and sort of crosses over into medical stuff a bit. So, final comment here, just real quickly from all of you. I'm wondering, when you look, let's say 10 years into the future, where do you hope we are on big data that is different for the patient than it is right now? You want to start?
I think I've said this 2 or 3 times. I hope we have truly a learning healthcare system in which patients can learn what best to do for themselves, since they're mostly the responsible party in taking care of them, and we help them. We equip them with the information that they need because we're all part of a learning delivery system.
Beyond the things I hope will get covered by others, there is a real opportunity to enable people to stop flying blind with regard to where they are in their disease and in health. And I think that if people engage in that process of building that out, not letting but people begin to engage and see that that's their task, each of us, our own task to do that, then I think this quantitative assessment of what it is that's going on between health and disease is going to be happening 10 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say that I hope we're not talking about big data or patient engagement. It's just in the background, and it's not something that we have to talk about.
Okay.
That was exactly what I was going to say. I mean, we talked a decade and a half ago. It was like, all right, marketing agencies, what are you going to do about online marketing? And today, that's just what marketing is. Right. It's just built into the fabric of everything. And medicine needs to have data, patient engagement, and a really great relationship with technology built into its fabric as well.
And maybe to drive that to something a little more specific, and again, harking back to what I think a couple of people have said, having really, really good tools to help the people on the front lines, and that's the physicians, the care coordinators, the nurses, everyone involved in the healthcare system, to actually interpret some of this patient source data in a way that puts it into context and allows them to leverage the authority that the clinician has with the patient to give them useful, actionable advice based on that data.
Well, the 3 of you just stole exactly what I was going to say, but I'm absolutely not to have a panel like this in 10 years would be nice. Not that this wasn't fun. This is a lot of fun.
But, saying you don't want to come back here in 10 years and just do it again.
But the idea that we're not talking about big data, it's about information and insights that is really just integrated in the fabric of clinical decision making. And so it's nothing that's super new or innovative. It's just what's being done.
Well, thanks to a great panel. Thanks for great questions.
Thank you all.
Wonderful.